History remembers conquerors, men who marched across continents with swords and armies. But one woman conquered the most powerful empire on Earth without ever commanding an army. Her name was Cleopatra, the last queen of Egypt, a ruler whose intelligence, charm, and political genius shaped the fate of Rome itself, and whose story still echoes through history more than 2,000 years later. In the 1st century before Christ, Egypt was one of the richest kingdoms on Earth. Green fields stretched along the fertile Nile, gold flowed through royal treasuries, and at the heart of it all stood Alexandria, a city of knowledge, power, and wealth. But Egypt was no longer the unstoppable empire it once was. Now it stood in the shadow of a rising superpower, Rome. In 69 BC, a princess was born into the ruling family of Egypt. Her name was Cleopatra VII. She belonged to the Ptolemaic dynasty, a Greek royal family that had ruled Egypt since the time of Alexander the Great. But unlike many rulers before her, Cleopatra would become something extraordinary. Most rulers inherited power. Cleopatra prepared for it. She studied languages, philosophy, science, and politics. Legend says she could speak 9 languages, including Egyptian, Greek, and Latin. In a world ruled by men and empires, Cleopatra was preparing to outthink them all. But royal power in Egypt was never safe. When Cleopatra's father died, the throne did not belong to her alone. By tradition, she was forced to rule alongside her younger brother and husband, a boy king. Soon, Cleopatra's political enemies began plotting. Powerful advisors around the young king feared her intelligence and her influence. So they did what palace conspirators have always done. They removed her. Cleopatra was forced to flee Egypt, exiled from the throne that was rightfully hers.
Most rulers would have disappeared into history, but Cleopatra was not most rulers. From exile in the desert, she began building allies. She studied the greatest power in the Mediterranean, Rome, and she waited for the perfect moment to return. Meanwhile, Rome itself was tearing apart. 2 of its most powerful leaders had become enemies. On one side stood the legendary general Julius Caesar. On the other, his rival Pompey. Their conflict would change the fate of Egypt forever. When Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt pursuing his enemy, Cleopatra saw her opportunity. But she could not simply walk into the palace. Her enemies controlled the city. So Cleopatra did something that would become legend. She smuggled herself into the palace, hidden inside a carpet. When the carpet was unrolled, out stepped Cleopatra, young, brilliant, and fearless, standing before the most powerful man in Rome. That moment would begin one of the most influential alliances in history. Caesar quickly understood something others had underestimated. Cleopatra was not just a queen, she was a strategist. If Rome supported her claim to the throne, Egypt would become Rome's strongest ally in the east. So Caesar made his decision. He would help Cleopatra reclaim her crown. But Cleopatra's enemies refused to surrender power. Soon, the streets of Alexandria erupted into conflict. Roman soldiers clashed with Egyptian forces loyal to the young king. The struggle for Egypt had begun. For months, Caesar and Cleopatra were trapped inside the royal palace. Outside, thousands of enemy soldiers surrounded them. But Caesar's legendary military skill held the line, and slowly, the balance of power shifted. Finally, the decisive battle came along the Nile. Caesar's reinforcements arrived. Cleopatra's enemies were defeated. The boy king drowned while fleeing across the river, and Cleopatra became the undisputed queen of Egypt. At just 21 years old, Cleopatra ruled the richest kingdom in the Mediterranean, but her greatest alliance was still standing beside her, Julius Caesar. Soon, Cleopatra gave birth to a son. She named him Caesarion. Many believed the child was the son of Caesar himself. If true, this boy carried the blood of both Egypt and Rome.
Cleopatra eventually traveled to Rome itself. There, she stayed as Caesar's honored guest. For many Romans, the Egyptian queen was both fascinating and terrifying, because her influence over Caesar was undeniable. Rumors spread through the Roman Senate. Was Caesar planning to make Cleopatra queen of Rome? Would Egypt and Rome merge into a single empire? Fear began to grow among Rome's powerful elite. In 44 BC, Rome exploded in betrayal. Julius Caesar was assassinated inside the Senate. The man who had helped restore Cleopatra's throne was gone. Cleopatra quickly understood the danger. Rome was descending into chaos. She returned to Egypt and waited once again for the next power rising in Rome.
After Caesar's death, Rome split between three powerful men. Among them was one of Caesar's most loyal generals, Mark Antony. Antony summoned Cleopatra to meet him. He wanted to know whether Egypt would support his power, but Cleopatra planned something far more dramatic. Cleopatra sailed to meet Antony in one of the most famous entrances in history. Her ship was covered in gold. Purple sails caught the wind, and music echoed across the river. It was theater, and Antony was captivated. The meeting between Cleopatra and Mark Antony quickly became legendary. Politics turned into partnership. Partnership turned into romance. Together, they began shaping the future of the Eastern Mediterranean. Cleopatra and Antony became the most powerful couple in the ancient world. Antony controlled Rome's eastern armies. Cleopatra controlled Egypt's wealth. Together, they were unstoppable. Their alliance produced 3 children. Cleopatra envisioned a future where her dynasty ruled a vast Eastern empire. But Rome was watching and growing increasingly alarmed. Back in Rome, another leader was rising, Caesar's adopted heir, Octavian, the future emperor of Rome. Octavian began a campaign against Antony. He accused him of being controlled by Cleopatra, of abandoning Rome for an Egyptian queen. The Roman people were furious. Soon, diplomacy collapsed. Rome declared war, that officially not against Antony, against Cleopatra. The fate of Egypt would be decided in a single battle, a naval battle off the coast of Greece, the Battle of Actium. In 31 BC, the fleets of Antony and Cleopatra faced the forces of Octavian. The outcome would decide the future of the Mediterranean. As the battle intensified, Cleopatra made a sudden decision. Her fleet turned and sailed away. Antony followed. Their forces collapsed. Octavian's victory was complete. Antony and Cleopatra retreated to Egypt, but Rome was coming. 1 year later, Octavian invaded Egypt. Alexandria fell. The dream of Cleopatra's empire was over. Mark Antony attempted one final battle, but his forces deserted him. Defeat was certain. Believing Cleopatra had already died, Antony took his own life. He died in her arms. Now only Cleopatra remained. Captured by Octavian, she would be paraded through Rome as a trophy. Cleopatra refused that fate. According to legend, Cleopatra chose death, a venomous snake hidden inside a basket, the final act of a queen who refused to surrender. With Cleopatra's death, the ancient kingdom of Egypt came to an end. It became a province of Rome. Octavian would soon become Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, and Cleopatra would become legend. For centuries, historians debated Cleopatra's power. Was it beauty, charm, or something far more dangerous?
intelligence, strategy, and an understanding of power that rivaled Rome's greatest leaders. She never commanded an army, yet she shaped the destiny of the Roman world. Cleopatra, the queen who conquered Rome without an army.